Good morning, everyone. Welcome to another edition of Inquisition Update. My name's Tom Fress, and I'll be your host for the next hour. You're listening to FirstAmendmentRadio.com. Thanks for tuning in, everyone. And I know I could just feel it in my bones. My listeners are anxious to resume our discussion of this book, History of Romanism. The History of Romanism by John Dowling. We're learning about the rise of the Antichrist. This is history. And it's not future history, it's ancient history. The Antichrist assumed his diabolical role in the world early in the Christian era, and that's the subject of discussion in this book, The History of Romanism. The papacy is, was, and always will be the Antichrist of the Bible, and the Protestant reformers knew it. Catholics all throughout the centuries knew it and accused the papacy of being the Antichrist, and the papacy responded by presenting two alternatives of Bible prophecy interpretation, those that exonerate the papacy of that role, the preterism and futurism. They are the orthodox teaching in the churches today. That's why few people suspect the papacy as the Antichrist of the Bible. But we're going to talk about how the papacy clawed its way to its diabolical role in the world that it enjoys today. King of kings and Lord of lords. That's the status of the popes today. He's the head of all the churches, and he's the head of all the governments. But it was not always so. In the beginning, the pope was just a bishop among bishops. And eventually, by the Emperor Focus, or Justinian's decree rather, that the Pope became the universal head of all the churches, the spiritual head of all of Christendom. Okay? But there was one hurdle yet to leap for the papacy, and that was to become King of Kings. And that's the subject we're talking about this morning. We're currently in Book 3 of this assembly of books called The History of Romanism by John Dowling, and we're in subsection 2, and we're dealing with how God has literally made a mockery of the papacy so that no one of his saints should be confused and think the papacy is anything but what it is, the Antichrist of the Bible. God has literally made a mockery, of an open mockery for centuries of the papacy. And this is God's divine providence. Listen as we read in subsection 2 on page 134 if you're following along. He says the popes were still the subjects of the Roman emperors, and their election to the popedom gave them no official authority till confirmed either by the emperor himself or his viceroy in Italy, the Exarch of Ravenna. Okay? So here we have the great restrainer that Paul talked about in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 and verse 7. He who now letteth, that is the Roman emperors, will let or restrain until he be taken out of the way. Well, at this point, the emperor is still in control of who sits on the papal throne. If one is elected to be the pope, in order to take his papal throne, he must first be confirmed by the emperor, the restrainer, the let, that Paul talked about, 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 7. So, the papacy has not been fully revealed. Okay, he has his spiritual authority, but he has no kingly status at this point. All right, the author continues. He says, this, of course, was nothing more than natural and just, that since this spiritual sovereignty was created by the emperor, it should be confirmed by the same authority, the emperor. Okay? So, the papacy got its spiritual crown from the emperor. Okay? And so, holding to that thesis, the emperor maintained the authority to confirm or deny, once elected, a pope from occupying the throne. So the restrainer is still in authority. That let that Paul talked about is still in control. Now he says sometimes when the popes elect were suspected of being opposed to the views of the emperor, considerable difficulty was experienced in obtaining the imperial confirmation of their election. Okay? So first, before you can take the throne, you have to please the emperor, the restrainer, the let, right? He says, thus, upon the election of Pope Silverinus in 640 A.D., we learn from a letter of the monk Maximus that the emperor Heraclius at the time instigated at the instigation of the clergy of Constantinople, refused to confirm his election to the popedom till his legates had promised the emperor to persuade the newly elected pope to sign the ekthesis. Okay, we're going to talk about that more in later chapters. A decree of which we shall hear more of in a future chapter. But adds the monk, though they complied with the emperor's demand, though the popes complied with the emperor's demand, they never intended to perform so sinful a promise. So, the emperor placed an obstacle for the pope. He must first sign the ekthesis, whatever that is. We're going to find out later in the book. He had to first sign an ekthesis, it's called, and a decree of which we shall hear more of in the future chapter, but adds the monk, that the monk plainly says in his letter that the popes had no intent to keep any promises made in this decree. Okay? He said, so that, as Bauer, the historian, remarks, quote, they did not, it seemed, think it sinful to make a promise which they thought it sinful to perform, unquote. So the popes never intended to keep. Look, the papacy, the Antichrist of the Bible, has never willingly accepted or adhered to any authority superior to itself. The papacy, in Satan's scheme of things, the papacy, from its beginning, intended to replace Christ on this earth, to accept no authority on this earth as superior to the Pope. No king, no priest, no apostle, and no God in heaven should ever have authority over the papacy. Okay? The Bible plainly says he sits in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. Okay? Above all that is called God or that is worshipped. Those are divine words. Those are divinely inspired words. Now, if you wish to understand how the papacy sees itself, you must take the Word of God as your key, as the only source of truth. Regarding the papacy, it says he sits in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God, and is worshipped above all that is called God. Now that means there should be no authority over the papacy. And here we have an emperor presuming to approve or confirm the election of a pope and forcing the papacy to sign this so-called ekthesis, a decree, no doubt acknowledging the emperor's superiority over the papacy, and simply made the promise to sign it but never intending to keep it, because the papacy has no superior in the world. He is King of Kings and Lord of Lords. That's the position that he is prophesied to have to attain in the world, just as though he were Christ on earth. And so we continue, he says, so that as Bauer, the historian, remarks, quote, they, the popes, did not, it seemed, think it sinful to make a promise which they thought it sinful to perform. In other words, the papacy thinks it's sinful for them to make any concession whatsoever, either to the emperor or to God himself. All right? And so the papacy, while signing this ekthesis, had absolutely no intent whatsoever to abide by this decree. That is, acknowledging the emperor as supreme or superior over the papacy. Any more than that if Christ, if he were physically ruling and reigning on this earth, would have a superior among mortals. That's how the papacy sees itself. Now he says, a characteristic illustration of the genuine popish morality. Okay? This is the example of popish morality. He says, but why complain? Heraclius, in the estimation of the Pope and his legates, was a heretic, and the votaries of Rome had already learned to act upon the principles so shamelessly avowed 7 or 8 centuries later in the Council of Constance, that no faith is to be kept with heretics. In other words, no promise made to a heretic, in this case the emperor himself, is to be kept. No faithfulness whatsoever. In other words, you can lie right through your teeth to the emperor because you don't answer to him. He's a heretic. Okay? The Pope has no authority over him in this world. And when the Pope makes a promise to a king or a potentate anywhere in the world, it's as though he were speaking to a heretic. And the Council of Constance is Roman Catholic canon law established that says that the papacy has no obligation to keep faithfulness with heretics. Now, I want to talk a little bit about Vatican Council II. Starting with the Council of Trent 500 years ago, it was determined that Protestants were heretics. Okay, but the Council of Constance, which preceded it by 8 centuries, or by the 8th century A.D., says that the papacy is to keep no faithfulness with heretics. All right, now at Vatican Council II, the papacy, always having before from the Council of Trent regarded Protestants as heretics, and had no faith or kept no faithfulness with Protestants, all of a sudden changed his tune at Vatican Council II and began to call them separated brethren. But trust me, according to the Council of Constance, he can call them anything he wants, but he still regards Protestants, those who protest the papacy as the Antichrist, as heretics. And whatever promises, whatever peace overtures were made between the papacy and the leaders of the Protestant and evangelical churches isn't worth the breath to speak it. It isn't worth the paper it's printed on. The papacy will be bound by no authority in the world, including normal ethics. So, just as the papacy would agree to sign this ekthesis acknowledging the emperor's authority over the papacy and never intending to keep a promise of that sort, likewise Vatican Council II is a fraud. Okay? The papacy has no obligation to keep faith with heretics. And a separated brethren is still a heretic until he comes into the full communion with the Roman Catholic Church. That means that he must accept the papacy as it were God on earth. Okay. Now, the consequence of this delay was that Pope Silverinus was not ordained until about 1.5 years after his election. Okay, so this signing of this ekthesis caused a little heartburn. And there was a little doubt on the part of the emperor that the Pope agreed with his ruling authority. And so the emperor, the restrainer, withheld his confirmation of the Pope for a year and a half. Okay? Now, do you see that if the Pope is truly, by God's ordination, the vicar of Christ, the replacement of the Son of God on earth, do you think God would allow this quote-unquote heretic, this emperor, to withhold his ratification of the election of this Pope for a year and a half? This is where I say that history, divine providence, has made an open mockery of the papacy. And this is so that no saint of God on earth would ever be deceived about who this papacy is. It's the man of sin. It's the son of perdition. It's that wicked that rose after the restrainers were taken out of the way. And God has thrown a monkey wrench into the works of the Pope all throughout history, confounding and making obstacles and stumbling blocks in front of the papacy. And God's people are supposed to recognize this. God's people are supposed to see these obstacles that God has placed in the path of the papacy as our confirmation that the papacy is nothing in the world but an open mockery. This papacy seeks to exalt himself above the stars of God, to sit upon the mount of the congregation in the side of the north, to ascend above the heights of the clouds, to be like the Most High. And without God's intervention, he would, as obvious as the Council of Trent and Vatican Council II, the world would accept him. But God keeps putting these obstacles in front of the papacy so that God's people would never be deceived. Listen, I say again, I know it's repetitious, but it bears to be said. We, God's saints, are to know as certainly who the Antichrist is as we are to certainly know who the Christ is. God did not send his Son to die and then leave the saints for whom his blood was shed in jeopardy of being deceived by this Antichrist. It is an assault, it's an insult to God when we say we do not know who the Antichrist is, or we must speculate about who the Antichrist is. We are literally saying that God plays fast and loose with the blood of the saints for whom his Son bled and died. If he thought enough of us, if he loved us enough to send his Son to die for us, and then leave us subject to a liar, a counterfeit who would rob us of God's grace and place us into a system of works, in other words, to replace Christ and to preach another gospel, what kind of a God would it be? We insult him when we say we don't know who the Antichrist is, or that the Antichrist is yet future. God has taken the last 2,000 years of the world, of history, to prove to us who the Antichrist is, so that none of us would be deceived by this and be robbed of the mercy that he showed us in his Son. Okay, we are not to be subjects of the Pope, nor his governments. Okay, we must protest. That's what Protestantism is all about. The vast majority of the world has no clue who this Antichrist is. And sadly, most of them call themselves Christians. They open their Bibles, they read, but they do not understand. And this is an important book for us. The Roman Catholic Council of Constance in the 8th century decreed that the papacy has no faith to be kept with heretics. In other words, they can lie out their teeth. All right? And that's what the papacy did to this emperor, lied through their teeth, acknowledging the Pope, or acknowledging the emperor as superior when it never had any intention whatsoever to obey that sinful promise. All right? This is how God has made an open mockery of the papacy for the whole world to see, for all of his saints to see. Did God make promises he never intended to keep? No. So how can this papacy be the vicar of Christ? Okay, this is God's hand at work here. All right, the consequence of this delay was that Pope Severinus was not ordained until a year and a half after his election. So God threw a monkey wrench into the works of Antichrist so that we would all know who the Antichrist is. That he is no vicar of Christ. He has no rightful claim to spiritual authority nor temporal authority. All right, subsection 3, it says in 685, Pope Benedict II, according to the account of the Romish historian Anastasius, had sufficient influence with the Emperor Constantine IV to obtain from him a decree permitting the ordination of popes in the future immediately upon their election, without waiting for the confirmation of the emperor or the deputy in Italy. But in less than 2 years, Justinian, who had succeeded his father to the empire, conceived this to be a dangerous concession, revoked the decree, and vested the power of confirming the election of future popes in the Exarch of Italy, commonly called, from the place of his residence, the Exarch of Ravenna. So, here's an example of the papacy making an attempt to ascend the papal throne without any input at all from the emperor. Okay? Look, it took the power of the emperor to grant the Pope his spiritual sovereignty over all the churches. And now the papacy wants to do away with the emperor altogether. Now, look, common sense dictates that if the papacy wants to get rid of the emperor altogether, then he's got to surrender his spiritual power, right? Because the emperor is from whom he got it. But that's not the way the papacy plays the game. The papacy wants its cake and its frosting too. So now that the papacy has achieved the spiritual authority over all the churches by grant of the emperor, now the papacy wants to do away with the emperor altogether and still maintain his spiritual authority. You see, that wouldn't even pass for child's play, would it? Isn't it interesting how God has made a mockery of the papacy? This is for all the world of the saints to see, so that none of us would be confused. None of us would have a question. That God has literally made an open mockery of the papacy so that none of us would be deceived by him. Now we've come upon the break. We'll continue with our reading and discussion of the history of Romanism by John Dowling. Precious, precious Protestant work. Right after the message. You're listening to Inquisition Update on First Amendment Radio.
Years ahead of the dominant media, FirstAmendmentRadio.com and FirstAmendmentRadio.net. The program you are listening to is 100% sponsored by you, the listener, on this First Amendment Rights media channel. You've noticed that there are few commercials on this radio network, and there's a good reason for that. Corporate advertising dollars come with strings that limit program content. So without your help, these programs cannot continue on satellite, internet, or our various affiliates. These programs are not commercially viable and must be supported by those faithful to the cause of truth. Look for the button to sponsor your favorite programs on our Listen and Schedule pages. Then when you subscribe, we'll send you the last quarterly MP3 CD of that program immediately and continue with each new quarter. We will also give you unlimited archive access to all of our programs. We ask you to give much less than a tithe so that you may also send support directly to a particular program, host, or cause, and anywhere else the Spirit may lead you. Do all to the glory of our God and Creator, for His holy nation, the only kingdom that will last forever. Thank you for listening.
The book of Revelation says, the spirit of prophecy is the testimony of Jesus Christ. This is at the very heart of FirstAmendmentRadio.com. In that spirit, we have created the Prophecy Reality News app for all of your mobile devices, streaming First Amendment Radio 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Available for your Apple, Android device, and smartphone, absolutely free. Get the Prophecy Reality News app installed today so you can listen to First Amendment Radio wherever you are. The Prophecy Reality News app. Get it now.
Gold and silver is tremendously undervalued. Global demand vastly exceeds mine supply by more than 60% annually. There is little in the financial world more certain than a coming explosion in the prices of gold and silver. The U.S. dollar continues to lose value and respect as the world's reserve currency. Our nation faces challenges on many fronts, and a day doesn't pass without another economist bringing forth warnings of impending economic calamity. There has never been a better time than right now to acquire physical gold and silver. Discount Gold and Silver Trading was founded on the principles of truth and honesty. We believe in providing a quality product, quality service, and most importantly, competitive pricing. We provide all forms of precious metals, including American gold, silver, platinum, and rare investment and circulated coins. Silver bars, rounds, and 90% silver bags are on hand for the silver investor. Gold self-directed IRAs are available. Call Discount Gold and Silver Trading at 1-800-375-4188. Toll free, that's 1-800-375-4188.
Welcome back from the break. You're listening to the second half hour of Inquisition Update on First Amendment Radio. And if you'd like to support this program, please support First Amendment Radio, who sponsors it. Now, back to business. Listen as I read and see how God has made an open mockery of this jackass in Rome. Okay? Don't be offended by my language. We're not talking about Christ. We're talking about Antichrist. We're talking about the usurper. We're talking about the pretended Christ, the one who would make a mockery of the gospel and a mockery of God, and who would exalt himself above the stars of God and be like God himself on the earth. Martin Luther, the Protestant reformer, called the papacy what it is: a jackass, the Antichrist. He's a braying fool. Okay, he's not to be believed on in the world. He's to be rejected by the saints. He's to be called what he is: a mask for Satan himself. That's what Martin Luther called him. That's what he is. Don't be offended by my language. What would you think if a child, an invalid, would exalt himself above the stars of God and claim to be God on earth? You'd call him a jackass, wouldn't you? Well, that's what the papacy is. Now, God is proving it. God is making an open mockery of this shameful Antichrist. Listen again what the author says. In 685 A.D., Pope Benedict II, according to the account of the Roman Catholic historian Anastasius, had sufficient influence with the Emperor Constantine IV to obtain from him a decree permitting the ordination of popes in the future immediately upon their election, without waiting for the confirmation of the emperor or his deputy in Italy. In other words, the popes who got their spiritual authority from the emperor now all of a sudden don't want the emperor having anything to do with the papacy. No more confirmation from the emperor. And he's not willing to give up the spiritual authority that he got from the emperor. Now he wants to be king of the emperor, too. All right, now look what happens. He says, but in less than 2 years, Justinian, who had succeeded his father in the empire, conceived this to be a dangerous concession, revoked the decree, and vested the power of confirming the election of future popes in the Exarch of Italy, commonly called, from the place of his residence, the Exarch of Ravenna. So, the Pope almost had it licked, and God threw a monkey wrench in it, and his son came to power and said, no, we're taking it back. You still have to be confirmed by the emperor or his exarch in Ravenna. You see what God did here? Now, if the papacy truly were a divine institution, sanctioned by God to be his vicar and replacement on the earth, do you think he would have this sort of problem? No. You're better to think like I think. God is making an open mockery of this papacy for all the world to see. And this is the confidence that the saints have always had throughout the centuries, that God was making an open mockery of this man of sin, this son of perdition, this pretender, this jackass. And none of us should be deceived. A child could comprehend that God is making an open mockery of this thing who says he is the replacement of the Son of God on earth. Now he says 2 or 3 years later, the exarch made, listen, this is very interesting. 2 or 3 years later, the exarch of Ravenna made a profitable use of this privilege by unjustly extorting an enormous sum of money from Pope Sergius before consenting to confirm his election. That's right. The papacy had to buy or bribe the emperor in order to get confirmed. An enormous sum of money. You think God isn't in the business of this? Making an open mockery. It just continues and continues and continues. He said it had ever been the custom, at least since the decree of the Emperor Phocas, to pay a certain sum into the imperial treasury when the election of a pope was confirmed. But in this case, the Exarch of Ravenna demanded a much larger sum than usual. The circumstances were these. In the year 687, 2 candidates for the popedom, Theodore and Pascal, had been elected by rival parties. In other words, the Roman Catholic Church has always had 2 sects within the church. They say that the Roman Catholic Church is united. There's division in that church. And this is proof, early in the papacy, those 2 parties within the Roman Catholic Church, you might consider one of them to be the conservative wing of the Roman Catholic Church, the other to be the liberal wing of the Roman Catholic Church. The same liberals, the same conservatives that rule in Washington, D.C., that's just Catholics fighting Catholics, that's all they are. And they elected their own popes. All right, so there's 2 antichrists in the world now. You see God making a mockery of this? Do you think there would be such a thing if the papacy were a divine institution sanctioned by God himself? No. It's open mockery. This is divine providence unfolding before your very eyes. This is history. How God has proven the papacy to be a fiction. Okay? He is nothing in the world. Now, we have the Roman Catholic Church that is supposed to be completely united under one head, now has 2 heads. And you're going to find out soon it's going to have a 3rd head. Okay? What is anything with 2 heads? It's a monster, isn't it? And what is it when it's got 3 heads? It's the Antichrist. He says a violent and disgraceful tumult ensued between the respective friends of each of these popes. The judges and the magistrates in Rome fought in vain, sought to bring the two ambitious priests to an agreement and to induce one to yield to the other. Okay? The Roman Catholics, the emperor, everyone's concerned. They want peace and unity in the church when the church is divided between two popes, right? Two men vying for the position of the Antichrist in the world. Okay? Now he says, failing in this attempt, they formed a new party, that is a third party, and proceeded to elect a third candidate named Sergius, and carried him in triumph to the Lateran Church, forced the gates open, and put him in possession of the place. Okay? You talk about third-party politics. That's what this is. The two sides couldn't agree. The liberals and conservatives couldn't agree. No one would concede. So we have two popes fighting for the throne. So the people said, we're going to raise up a third party. Third-party politics. They elected a third pope. They forced him into the Lateran Church at Rome, and they took possession of the place. You see God's hand in this? Praise His holy name. He doesn't want any of us to be deceived. Why should He? He sent His Son to die for us. He made certain that we would know. Just as certain as we are that Jesus is the Christ, we know the papacy is the Antichrist. And that God has proven it through His divine providence in the unfolding of the history of the popes. We have at this time 3 diabolical individuals seeking to be God on earth. And this is made possible by God's own providence, so that none of us would be deceived. He said, upon this, Theodore yielded his claim and joined the party of Sergius. Okay? So that would be like the Democrats giving up the election and then joining the third party politician in order to defeat the Republicans. Okay? You talk about intrigue. The Roman Catholic Church is dripping with intrigue. It always has and it always will. He says, upon this, Theodore yielded his claim to the papal chair and joined the party of Sergius, the third party candidate. He said the other competitor, Pascal, obstinately persisted in his claim. So now the contest is between Sergius, the third party, and Pascal. He said he had made a private agreement with the exarch to reward him with a bribe of 30 pounds of gold upon condition that he should be chosen and confirmed as pope. So here we are. Pascal is now buying the papacy from the emperor with money. Okay? Filthy lucre. This is called simony, the buying and selling of ecclesiastical power and authority. This is what Simon Magus tried to do. He tried to buy an apostleship, did he not? Acts chapter 8. And what did the apostle Peter say to him? I perceive that thou art of the gall of bitterness, out of the fetters of bondage. In other words, called him the Antichrist. Peter knew that simony would mark the Antichrist system. And Simon Magus was the first to use money to buy ecclesiastical authority and power. And simony has been a defining characteristic of the papacy from the very beginning. And this is only one example of unlimited examples where candidates of the papacy have used riches, earthly riches, to buy their power and authority. Now look, if God gives them their power and authority, as He does His Son, would He have to buy it? Did Jesus have to buy His power and authority? No. So then Jesus must be the Christ, and the papacy must be the Antichrist, right? See, it's not that difficult. He said, instead, therefore, of yielding to Sergius, he dispatched a messenger in all haste to Ravenna, for the exarch immediately to repair to Rome and consummate his agreement. Intrigue, political intrigue. He said, upon the arrival of the latter in the city, learning the discouraging situation of Pascal's affairs, and concluding that he could make a better bargain with Sergius, he immediately acknowledged him as Pope, but demanded the enormous sum of 100 pounds of gold before he would consent to confirm his election. Okay? So is this office of the papacy a divine institution or not? If it can be bought and sold with money, then you have to concede it's not. And this is a fixture in the election of popes, the buying and selling of ecclesiastical authority. Popes are bought and sold like cattle. Always have been, always will be. But there's no price that can be paid for Christ. He says, in the end, though much against his will, Sergius was under the necessity of submitting to the exorbitant demand, though he had to pawn the very ornaments of the tomb of St. Peter, as it were, before he could raise the sum necessary to secure the imperial signature to the decree confirming his election. The above is named upon the authority of Anastasius only as a specimen of the means frequently resorted to in order to supply the links in this boasted, unbroken chain of, quote, holy apostolic succession. Now, I want to explain to my listeners who are not familiar with this language. The popes claim and have always claimed to be the successors of Peter the apostle. That there is a divine succession between and a direct connection between Peter the apostle and all of the popes. That is, it is as if it were Peter still reigning over the church. Okay? Now hang on a second. Just as the Jews did in Jesus' day, who claimed to Jesus that they sat in Moses' seat, that they were successors of Moses, and that Jesus had no legitimate condemnation of them because they were successors of Moses, that's the role the papacy keeps today. It claims to be successors of the Apostle Peter, and they are above reproach. They cannot be judged by mortal man. They call it the apostolic succession, or the succession of the Apostle Peter. Okay? This is their claim to divine right to rule. They claim that Peter, who acknowledged Jesus as the Christ, the Son of the living God, to be the rock and foundation of the church. Not that Jesus was the rock and foundation of the church, but that Peter is the rock and foundation of the church. And all of the popes are his successors. They sit in Peter's seat, just like the diabolical religious leaders of Jesus' day said that they sat in Moses' seat. Okay, so if these popes are divinely elected and direct successors of the Apostle Peter, then why do they have to buy their popedom? With exorbitant sums of money, gold, and treasures of the church. Filthy lucre. Why do they have to practice simony? They can be bought and sold. How can this be a divine institution? The point is well made, isn't it? God has made all of these things evident to us so that we would none of us be deceived about who is the author of the Vatican, who is the author of the papal seat, who is the author of this pretender, this jackass who dares to call himself the Vicar of Christ. I make no apology for my language. He is what he is. Now he says it serves also as an illustration of the fact that the popes had not yet attained temporal sovereignty, but were still dependent for the spiritual power they wielded upon the emperors. Okay? They wielded spiritual power upon the emperors, a power that they got from the emperors. Again, do you see the mockery that God has made of every power pretended by the papacy? It's an obvious divine intervention so that none of us would be deceived. He says the popes, however, this is subsection 4, continuing, the popes, however, were restless under this odious restraint. Listen to the word chosen by this author, restraint. Isn't this what Paul called it, the apostle? He said, he who now letteth or restrains will let or restrain. The word let means to restrain until he's taken out of the way, and then that wicked shall be revealed. He says the popes, however, were restless under this odious restraint. What was the odious restraint? The restrainer, the emperor, the Caesar. This is prophecy being fulfilled. I don't think it's an unwise choice of words to call the emperor the restrainer. This is the fulfillment of Bible prophecy. He says the popes, however, were restless under this odious restraint. They had reached by means of the emperors the height of spiritual supremacy, and now they were anxious to knock away the ladder by which they had attained this eminence, render themselves completely independent of all earthly governments, and assume a rank among the temporal sovereigns of the earth. And they watched with eagle gaze for every opportunity of confirming and enlarging their power. Okay? So this author is very poignantly making the point that the papacy got its spiritual power from the emperors. The papacy got his universal bishop status from the emperors. The papacy got his spiritual sovereignty from the emperors. He got the title Bishop of Bishops, or Universal Bishop, head of all the churches, from the emperors. Not from God, from the emperors. And now the papacy wants to do away with the emperors confirming the papacy, so that the popes can take their throne without any restraint whatsoever. Okay? The Pope doesn't want to answer to anybody, including the temporal power that gave him his spiritual power. So when you look at that Roman Catholic flag, that papal flag, those two keys, the golden one representing the Pope's spiritual power, and the silver key representing his temporal power, it's a representation of the great mockery that God has made of the papacy. It's right on their flag for all the world to see, for all the saints to see, so that none of us would be deceived. So how is it that the papacy has deceived the whole world? How is it that the government of the United States serves the papacy morning, noon, and night? How is it that the government of the United States goes around the world in crusades, extending the power, the spiritual and the temporal power of the Pope all over this globe? To regime change, to change regimes, to bring de facto governments to their knees, to raise up de jure governments who will answer to the papacy. You have to ask yourself, what role does the United States play in the world today? And you'll find it in Revelation chapter 17 as called the second beast, who causes the whole world to worship the first beast, which is Rome. That is the prophetic, what's the word I want to use? That is the prophetic role of the United States in the world today, to elevate the papacy. Now, should any of us dare any longer to call the United States a Christian country when it causes the whole world to worship the papacy and answer to the papacy? It's a horrifying reality, isn't it? We sit and boast about this being the greatest country the world has ever seen, more liberty here than anywhere else, while we are bringing to destitution the rest of the world and putting them in fetters of Roman chains. How great will our judgment be when Christ returns? If left alone, without the United States in its prophetic role, the world may well have rejected the papacy long, long ago. But the United States is bringing all the other governments of the world under papal jurisdiction, papal control. Do you understand what an insult it is to Jesus, our Savior, to call the United States a Christian nation? Again, he says, the popes, however, were restless under this odious restraint. They had reached by means of the emperors the height of spiritual supremacy, and now they're anxious to knock away the ladder by which they had attained this eminence, render themselves independent of all earthly governments, and assume a rank among the temporal sovereigns of the earth. And they watched with eagle gaze for every opportunity of confirming and enlarging their power. One remarkable instance of this occurrence in the appointment by the sole authority of the Pope in 667 of Theodore as Archbishop of Canterbury in England, in consequence of the death of the prelate that had been appointed in England while waiting at Rome for his ordination. To reconcile King Oswy to his assumption, he, the Pope, sent him a flattering letter with a choice of collection of his trumpery relics, and to his spiritual daughter, the Queen, he sent a cross and a golden key, enriched with a portion of the filings of Peter's noted chain. Theodore, after having his head shaved according to the Roman law, was dispatched to England, with acknowledged in consequence of this having been chosen and ordained by the successor of St. Peter as primate of all England. Okay? We're going to talk about this more tomorrow. This is how the papacy interjected itself in what is believed in the world today to be Protestant England. We're going to see the history of the rise of the Antichrist within England, and it's going to open a lot of people's eyes. What a great, fantastic book this is. More than any other book I've ever read on Inquisition Update will prove to you once and for all who is the Antichrist in this world. We'll continue tomorrow.
Visit crosstheborder.org, CROSS, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of Nicholas Arthur's new book titled When the Third Temple is Built. That's crosstheborder.org. When it comes to prophecy today, much of the evangelical Christian world has their eyes on Israel, waiting and watching to see when the third temple will begin to be built. The plans are drawn, the Jewish people are eager. Most evangelical Christians today believe that the rapture will happen before the third temple is built. Hi, I'm Michael Eugene. I was taught that Daniel's 70th week was in the future. Is that really what the Bible teaches? Have we searched the scriptures and found this to be true? Why is it so important for a re-established Israel to build a third temple in Jerusalem? Is it necessary to build a temple on the same location already occupied by the Dome of the Rock? Is it necessary for sacrifices to take place in the temple on Temple Mount? Is there really a rapture followed by 7 years of tribulation? What is the New Testament temple? Can we identify history and prophecy? Who is the first beast in Revelation chapter 13? Who are the 7 kings in Revelation 17? I have asked all these questions, and I have found Nicholas Arthur's new book, When the Third Temple is Built, answers all these questions and more using Scripture to interpret Scripture. The Bible says that no prophecy of Scripture is of any private interpretation. Nicholas shows us in his new book, When the Third Temple is Built, how the Bible interprets prophecy and not man's private interpretation. Visit crosstheborder.org, C-R-O-S-S, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of Nicholas Arthur's new book titled When the Third Temple is Built. That's crosstheborder.org.